We're now going to hear the latest on Taiwan's recent presidential election. At least 4, if not all, of our panelists were just in Taiwan. 2 speakers traveled across the country, rearranging their schedules just so they could be with all of you today. And 1 is a surprise and just found out that he is speaking about an hour or so ago. Session 4 is Crossing the Strait, the Taiwan election and U.S. China relations. Please welcome Raymond Go, Maggie Lewis, Kharis Templeman, Chenjian C.J. Lee, and our moderator and advisory council member, Orville Schell. Please give them a round of applause.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you for assembling such an interesting day of events. And as you can see, we have quite a flock here. We've just had an election in Taiwan. And I have to say that, you know, someone who first went to Taiwan many, many decades ago, when Chiang Kai-shek was still enthroned, and not so dissimilar from Mao Zedong, to see the evolutionary progress of this society and body politic in the intervening years has been striking. It is also, I would say, in this world of ours, which doesn't have very many examples of hopeful evolutionary tracks, this is a hopeful one. So I think when you add this to the fact that the rest of the world, we see one piece after another falling into warfare, and the one shoe that has not yet dropped, and God willing, it will not drop, that is in the Taiwan Straits. This election is of paramount importance. So we have a wonderful group here because we have, well, I'll just start at the far end. Li Chenjian is from China. He's a scientist, is at Stanford, at Hoover, Stanford Medical School, just got back from observing the election in Taiwan. We have Raymond Guo, who works at the RAND Corporation, runs their China initiative. Kharis Templeman is a local boy here across the street from Hoover, runs the Hoover's Taiwan program there, and also was just in Taiwan. Maggie, you are from Seton Hall, a law professor, associate dean, and a long time follower of things relating to Taiwan. So here's 3 questions, and each of you, let's try to keep answers short and keep moving fast. What do the elections mean? What is China making of these elections? What is going to happen, both in terms of the role Taiwan plays in the sort of geopolitical mix? And how are these 3 parties, which won substantial votes in the legislative yuan, and also for the presidential office, this is the 3rd term for the DPP, how are they going to array themselves to do something? So let's start with you, Meg. Well, let's just go down the line here.
I'll start maybe with the what do the elections mean, and then we can mix it up from there. And I think we could also can compare general levels of jet lag and exhaustion, because when we're there for the elections, we go hard and try to pack in as much as we can. I first went to Taiwan in, I guess, 2006, and it was to study the vestiges of martial law. And at that point, we were just a decade out from the first direct presidential election, which isn't that much time. And so even in this intervening time, you've really seen Taiwan's democracy flourish. It is vibrant, overused, but true. And just part of the amazing process of being there is polls open at 8 a.m. They close at 4 p.m. Then you can go and watch the votes being counted. We went to a temple where they were voting. And then within about 3-4 hours, we knew who won. And then the people who lost admitted they lost. They accepted it. And the next day we went out to breakfast and everything was fine. So I just really think that that's, something that's to be celebrated. One point, this wasn't different than 4 years ago for many reasons. One is that we had a third party that took a sizable chunk of the votes, the Taiwan People's Party, which is really just Ko and-je's force of personality. And this was interesting because we've had such a DPP-KMT contrast without having such a real force of a third party that wasn't a fringe party. We had a really hard time pinning down the TPP and Ko himself about what his platform was. He's notorious for saying things like, I'm pragmatic and scientific, but not articulating policy. But there was definitely a sense, especially among younger voters and younger male voters, that he brought some electricity and just a difference from the binary KMT DPP. And finally, I'll just say one thing I noticed between 2020 and 2024 was the absence of the Hong Kong factor. When we were there in 2020, there was the black Hong Kong protest flags. There was a real sense of imminence of threat. And even though, of course, China was a huge part of the discussion, it didn't have the same emotional charge as when we were there and the Hong Kong protests were going on.
Mm-hmm. Kharis, what thoughts filled your head as you flew home?
This was the fourth presidential election I've observed in person in Taiwan. And unlike 2008, 2016, or 2020, it felt a bit more subdued, actually, than all three of those previous elections. In 2020, there was a very polarizing candidate on the ticket, Han Kuo-yu, who you either loved or hated. And that turned a lot of people out to vote on both sides. And this time around, all three candidates, I thought, they didn't incite the same kind of passion or sense of fear. And in addition to that, all three candidates on their cross-strait policies and their domestic policies, I thought were in a kind of muddled middle in the center. So Taiwan voters didn't have this stark existential choice between candidates in the way that 2020 was presented to them, or if we go back to 2016, that was a referendum on the Ma era engagement, and it was a very clear choice between continuing that or choosing to move in a different direction, and voters overwhelmingly chose Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP to move in a different direction. And then in 2008, it was a referendum on the Chen Shui-bian era, and voters moved in the other direction. And so we really got a split decision out of the voters here, with even the winner only winning 40% of the vote. The legislature, the DPP actually lost their majority there, and so we have no one party controls a majority in the legislature now. And so just overall, the sense that it was kind of a more subdued campaign, and one that voters often acted like they had to make the best of a bad set of choices. Nobody really inspired them in the same way that 2020 or 2016 did.
So Raymond, what do you think the outcome of this election means, and particularly for the rest of the world? Sure.
I mean, Kharis has said this a couple times in previous engagements, that the international media kind of focused on the election as the election that causes World War III. Whereas we're in Taiwan, they're like, no, not really. I mean, I think particularly for China, in the last 8 years, they've been able to say, okay, everything is the DPP's fault. DPP's in the presidency, it's also got control of the legislature, and there's some certain rationale to that. Now they have to be a bit more cautious. They have a bit of a dog in the fight. So I think they have been more cautious in terms of, say, military demonstrations and coercion. I wouldn't expect, those coercions, they're blunt signals, right? It's very hard to say, this military exercise is purely directed towards Lai Ching and Bi-khim Schell. It's not about the KMT or the TPP. The signals don't really work that way. And so they have to be a bit more cautious. I wouldn't expect military coercion until, say, March or April when the weather gets better, and around Inauguration Day on May 20th, because that is, I think, a political calendar one that's very clearly about the DPP. Right now, though, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, doesn't want to drive more support back over the back to the DPP by validating their concerns about a China threat. If anything, they want to kind of tamp it down so that KMT and TPP can reach some sort of agreement and kind of dominate the legislature.
Chenjian, you grew up in China, and here you are in Taiwan watching a democratic election, and you did a kind of an informal survey. So tell us two things. One, what did you conclude from your survey of Taiwanese voters? And also, how do you imagine your fellow comrades back in the People's Republic would respond if they were in your shoes, standing in Taiwan, watching what was going on?
Okay, thank you for adding me to this panel.
Yes, he's a late addition, but I thought a good one.
I tried to resist that. Differently from all the four experts, I am not a person studying politics or governance. I'm a physician scientist. So taking what I am going to say with a grain of salt, or more than a grain of salt. And another disclaimer, I have to disclose that I'm a U.S. citizen. So my view does not represent that of the mainland Chinese. But I can tell you what I feel, what I learned, and try to be objective. I think the Taiwan election, what I observed, is a good example of liberal democracy wins in the end. It's civil. There's the debate. The heat of debating is much less than what we observe here. And after the election concluded, I agree with you, both sides, the winners and losers, were very gracious. They congratulate the winners, and the winner says, thank you very much. So all these are good ones. And from the Taiwan people, that's one thing good of being a physician, that I talk to people from the leaders to the poorest guy on the street, both in China and here in Taiwan. The sense I got is people have come to live with the liberal democracy. It's no longer a remote ideology. It's what they live day by day. You and I have different opinions. We talk about it, we debate, and then we have a vote. Whoever wins, there you go. So I think it's much more mature than 20 years ago. And it's quite amazing, only 35 years democracy came into being in Taiwan. It's truly remarkable. Now, the problems that Taiwanese are facing, they are domestic problems that are universal, the housing price for young people and all that. I think those are very, very clear. And there is a very clear age difference among the three parties. I went to the TPP, the newest party, and what you see are the people in their 20s, and people like me are already very, very standing out. You go to the DPP rally, then you see all ages. And if you go to KMT rally, mostly people are at least above 40 or even 50. So there is a clear sort of division of age. And the youngest group, interestingly, is the group that uses TikTok. So what I observed is the social media factor in having people getting their information, analyzing, influencing their thinking is huge. That factor is unbelievable. Now, beyond that, on the other side, what does it mean? I think to Taiwan people, it means they experienced one more pretty good discussion and debate and voting the democratic process. And I think the three parties, all of them agreed, especially on the cross-strait relationship, which is the maintaining the current status quo. None of them is radical in that sense. So it's pretty much the same. On the other side, in the mainland, I haven't talked to my colleagues there because I'm just coming back straight from Taiwan. From what I learned from media, social media, is it's pretty much the same, except I think they realize that Taiwan reunification purpose is harder to obtain because all three parties, including KMT even, it's not pro-unification. The former president Ma had an interview with a news media from Germany, and that was, it's a little bit unfair to him. He was quoted a little bit out of the context, but he did say we need to trust and all that. So that was a backfire. So I think that signals to the other side, if you want to look at the Taiwan people in general, the pro-unification factor is low, at least. Okay. What does it mean? It could mean many things. And I want to tell you, in the mainland, there are different fractions too. It's not monolithic. There are far-end pro-democracy thinkers and people who basically say, well, you know what? Open society is the principle and the self-determination is what we think. So you should decide later on what you want to do. This is a minority, but it does exist. There is this very nationalist thinking, like what's mine is mine, we need to get it back from historical view. There's also a fraction, pretty large number, which is what I would think is more on the realism end and looking at the geopolitical factor. And this fraction basically says, just go and read your map. That is a strategic position for China and for other countries. This is a place you cannot afford to lose. And interestingly, this group of people often cite what Professor John Mearsheimer says. You cannot imagine how popular he is in China. He's basically, forget about all these ideology, forget about all those geopolitics. And they cite that, well, look at what United States and Soviet Union argued about and almost had a war over Cuba. It's an independent country, but United States, we will not tolerate other people put missile on it, right? So they say the geopolitical position of that decides it has to be people fight about. So all these fractions, and I don't know the relative percentage, but I do know these fractions exist. How they compete with each other in dealing with the current situation, I have no idea.
So let me pose a question to you all. In 1972, when Mao Zedong met with Nixon and Kissinger, he said, you know, if it takes 100 years to solve Taiwan, no problem. When Deng Xiaoping was on his way to Washington to restore diplomatic relations with Jimmy Carter, he stopped in Japan and he said, let's just leave this for smarter future generations to solve. So my question to you all is, what's the urgency now? Why is the mainland driving this thing in the way that it is, and pushing the edge of the envelope through gray zone tactics and various other things that we all know about? How do you analyze this very obdurate response by the mainland? Because it's really in the picture. I mean, Taiwan isn't just some nice little country someplace having an election and, you know, celebrating democracy. It's stuck in the middle of an incredible geopolitical mousetrap. Who wants to try that?
Sure, I can give
Raymond, go.
Yeah. I mean, one of the main reasons why is because they can. You know, the military modernization, China's military modernization over the last 30 years has given them an incredible new array of capabilities. You know, an amphibious invasion is still extremely difficult. They probably don't have the sea lift capacity for it necessarily. Maybe they have the airlift capacity for it. But it's, you know, increasingly they're just able to do that. I think, you know, that's the military side. The political side is that, I think, twofold. One is that, you know, China observes these Taiwanese elections. They observe rising self-identification as only Taiwanese in Taiwan. There's a feeling that Taiwan is perhaps slipping out of its grasp, and especially after Hong Kong,
Is it?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, I think it depends on how you define it. Obviously, you know, unification on Taiwan is kind of a dead letter. Nobody's, like, there are people who are interested in it, but not really, and especially not after Hong Kong. And I think lastly is Xi Jinping himself. You know, we have moved from an era of party-led authoritarianism to more like, in political science jargon, a personalistic dictatorship. And I think as a result of that, Xi Jinping gets all the glory, but he also gets all the blame. There's no more party to help diffuse responsibility. And as a result, you know, in a lot of these sorts of situations, a lot of these cases, you tether your foreign policy to your domestic standing, because you need some way, I think Ryan mentioned earlier, diversionary conflicts or diversionary kind of situations so that you can pull people's attention from the domestic problems that China is very much facing right now and onto a foreign policy problem where the nationalism kicks in, which, between economics and nationalism, at least in my mind, those are the two twin pillars of the CCP's legitimacy and Xi Jinping's legitimacy. As China's economy stumbles, it's naturally going to shift over towards the more nationalistic side of levers, and Taiwan is right there. Same way with, of course, like confrontations with the Philippines in the South China Sea, Vietnam as well.
So can I add, so we've got the capabilities obviously increasing, the intentions unknown. Partially, we don't know what Xi Jinping thinks of his own sort of mortality. And I kind of hope he thinks he's going to live a long time so we can push it out, and how important psychologically Taiwan is to his legacy. But I think the psychology on Taiwan's side is fascinating, because one thing that we really had in this election was this 以美论, this skepticism of America. And would America really come to Taiwan's rescue, which goes back to Ryan's comments earlier about the Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. and their differing views about how engaged the U.S. should be outside its borders. And so I think, for example, the Ukraine situation is very different in many ways. However, we're watching to see, is there really a commitment on the part of the U.S. and particularly Congress to continue to be engaged? They're just sending weapons, not actually seeing Americans come back in body bags. And this was a real part of the conversation. And the KMT fed into this. Like, do you really think the U.S. is going to come in and on a white horse, or, a white ship, and save us? And that was a real part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Kharis, you've been watching this quite a while, and I'm wondering how as you have watched the idea that somehow Taiwan and China might yet come together, slip through the hands of the Kuomintang. Do you think there's any reprieve here? Do you think there's any way that these two pieces of Chinese real estate will come together again?
Well, I don't think it matters what I think. It matters what Xi Jinping thinks. And I think...
Well, it matters what the Taiwanese think, too.
Yeah. What I'll say here is I think Xi Jinping could interpret this election as a trend in the right direction, right? So you've had 2 terms of DPP rule. Tsai Ing-wen won both those elections really big, 57% and then 58%. And this time around, they're down to 40%. And
but there were 3 parties.
Yeah, and if you spin it right, well, you can say, well, if the other 2 parties had cooperated, and they almost did, then the DPP, and they said this actually after the election, does not represent mainstream public opinion in Taiwan. They've lost whatever mandate they had before, and so our strategy is working, basically. And let me just say a word about the strategy as well. So. The real pressure on Taiwan in terms of military, economic, and diplomatic coercion began with the inauguration of Tsai Ing-wen in 2016. Before then, there was regular cross-strait communication and an effort on Beijing's part to make the Ma administration look good. When Tsai came in and didn't, from Beijing's perspective, say the magic words to acknowledge a one China principle, they decided they couldn't work with her and they were going to try to squeeze her administration. And so the military flights, the economic coercion, and the flipping of diplomatic allies are all part of a very kind of conscious long-term strategy to try to pressure the DPP and undermine their support. But there's also a soft track here that's been ongoing the whole time, which is engagement with other parts of Taiwanese society that don't openly support independence or aren't linked directly to the DPP. And I expect that engagement will continue over the next 4 years. And in a sense, they can interpret this as, the strategy didn't work in the first 8 years, but now with a decline in support for the DPP, if that trend continues, well, we should just continue our program to have, on the one hand, a hard track where we're coercing the DPP administration, but on the other hand, a soft track where we continue to engage with the other parts of Taiwanese society and the economy. I mean, it's true today that you can still get on a flight in Taipei and be in Shanghai in 2 hours. They haven't cut off the economic exchanges that didn't exist to a great degree before they were established during the Ma era. So they've been, I think, much more subtle and careful and systematic about how they have approached coercing Taiwan and managing this relationship since Tsai took office.
Chenjian, you have a comment?
Yeah, directly to your question, what's the urgency here? Why not like Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping? I think there are several factors I sensed. The first one is the older generation are gradually fading away from the historical stage. When in 1949, mainland Chinese KMT went to Taiwan, and it was basically they're trying to fight back, retake the mainland China, 反攻大陆. Now this group of people are getting older and older, and the younger people, they grew up being a Taiwanese. So I think from the mainland China's view, more and more they diverge. They don't think they are part of the China. So that adds to the urgency. The second one is, I think the symbolism is important because in 2049, that will be the centennial of People's Republic China. And in both the ruling regime and pretty popular among people, that reunification, having the whole country back, is a strong, attractive goal. And if you calculate back 2049, to get that done, you pretty much need to get the agreement in 2000, maybe 35, 36. And then to do that, you need to get a pretty good picture before that. If you go back, then it means it is urgent. You cannot wait for the last minute, 2048, and start to work on that. So that adds to the urgency. And the other one is a little bit hidden, but I think it is important, which is Taiwan has been growing pretty in a healthy way economically, open society, rule, and all that. That itself poses a huge challenge to the mainland. And as an analogy is, if you have a identical twin, and you tell them as a physician, by nature, you will not be Michael Jordan, so forget about playing basketball. And one of them turned out to be Steve Curry. Say, hey, I don't need to be 6'5". I can. What does it say to the other side? So the ruling regime is telling Chinese people and the world that whatever you have in the West doesn't fit us. We have something unique historically, so on and so forth. And the recent economic boom in the past 30 years justifies that. Whereas Taiwan is showing a living example, say, dude, we can have another way. We can have open society, democracy, full democracy, and there is economic growth and so on and so forth. That itself stands in contrast with the other side big time, and that makes the other side feel the urgency. You got to deal with it. So I want to add these three elements to the discussion.
So we have a kind of a paradoxical situation here where the word independence cannot be spoken, and yet it's what everybody thinks they either have or want. How do we come to terms with that contradiction?
Do we need to?
Well, I mean, we've been doing this for 75 years, Raymond, strategic ambiguity.
Right.
But in actuality, there's nothing ambiguous about it. I mean, Taiwan has an election. Taiwan has a government. It has a military. It has. So I'm just wondering, how do we get beyond this? If you all can't imagine any time in the near future when these two Chinese cultural places would come together, Do you think we can walk the tightrope much longer?
So who's the we? So
the world.
Well, because I think, when I'm in Taiwan with my Taiwanese friends, first thing that Tsai Ing-wen did an amazing job of doing Republic of China, Taiwan, or brand Taiwan, that she would stand up there on Double 10 Day, the National Day, with ROC flags all around her, say Republic of China once, because it is the founding of the Republic of China Day, and then Taiwan, 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 Taiwan. And what we see again and again in public polls in Taiwan is, yes, if I could live in a world with unicorns and rainbows, I would prefer perhaps to have a passport that says Taiwan on it and a different flag, but we live in the world that we live in. And so a great comfort with the status quo is working. We're okay with being in this unusual, if really unique situation of having the Republic of China not fit maybe what I want. A lot of my friends at least are, more green leaning, but we're okay with it because that's the best choice. So that's one reason I think actually when you looked at, going back to the Ma Ying-jeou interview, that one aspect that was really interesting in the meetings, and Kharis and I were in a lot together, was the texture within the KMT, within the Pan Blues. And that once Ma Ying-jeou said, a very sort of, well, we're not going to win a war and, got to, figure out how to work together. Ho Yo-yi, the candidate, came out the next day in his international press conference, made very clear that I am a different kind of candidate, a different kind of KMT. And so that I found fascinating too, that it wasn't a soft line. And just one last thing, that when Ma Ying-jeou met with Xi Jinping in 2015, that was a different time and a different Xi Jinping. And also Ma Ying-jeou got a lot of low-hanging fruit, direct flights, mail, and the issues today are just so much more complicated. China's in a very different position as far as where the military is. So I thought also there was frustration amongst the more KMT folks we met with, that they would get sort of lectured by the 70 years and older about like, well, we were able to get along with China. They're like, well, try doing it now. It's a little more difficult than when Hu Jintao was in power. So those dynamics too. But that's all to say, I think for Taiwan's perspective, for people I know there, they're like, this is working well and we're going to try to hang on to it as long as we can.
Yeah. Well, fair enough, but it is in a state of terrible imbalance. Interestingly, when I think you were there on that trip we made to Taiwan, we met with the KMT and they said, oh, great, we're the party of negotiation and we don't want to go to war. And I remember very clearly somebody asked, great, tell us what scenario you think you could come up with that the mainland would agree with. And there was utter silence. Nobody had any thought about what the answer to that question is. So is there an answer?
Well, I think part of the answer is to buy time. And so you buy time in part because China's internal contradictions are going to manifest at some point. Their economy is slowing down. Their demographic crisis is now here. Their population declined last year. So they're facing a lot of headwinds, as somebody said earlier. And for Taiwan, and perhaps we can debate this, I am of the view that a slower growing China and one that's less confident in the world is actually less dangerous to Taiwan because they need Taiwan more as a partner and ally and a source of investment and ideas. The other piece of this is that Taiwan's future really depends on political change on the mainland. I think that's the path forward. And so Taiwan's existence as its demonstrated existence as a place where you can have Chinese culture and economic growth and also liberal democracy stands in, I would argue, really nice contrast to the PRC. And so Taiwan's survival as a liberal democracy is a key part of what will ensure its long-term future as well.
So if survival is the critical thing that needs to be cultivated, then what is the best U.S. policy? Deterrence? And what do we mean by that, if that's the answer?
Well, I'm on record as saying that the United States should adopt strategic clarity towards Taiwan. I think a lot of the debate that we have about commitments and alliances are, frankly, there's a lot of straw men out there. There's the if you hear the proponents of strategic ambiguity, they often say the U.S. cannot give an unconditional commitment to Taiwan. And I'm like, the U.S. doesn't give an unconditional commitment to anyone. The nature of international relations.
Except Biden has done it 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. We look at NATO. Article 5 says attack on one is an attack on all. But there are still conditions, right? The U.S. deliberately inserted language saying it has to abide by the constitutional processes of the member states. In international relations, it's a state of anarchy. There are no unconditional commitments ever. And so I think that's a bit of a straw man. Now, where I think strategic clarity can be very helpful for the United States is not just in terms of fighting against Yi Mei-lun, but also in terms of military coordination, operational coordination. And I'll be clear, I think the U.S. should only adopt strategic clarity once a lot of those military plans are already in place. But beyond that, it also opens up cooperation between Taiwan and Japan, Taiwan and Australia, possibly Taiwan and South Korea. Because we in the United States don't say what we're going to do, the Japanese cannot say, oh, you're going to do that? Great, we can do this. Or we are willing to do X, Y, and Z. But our strategic ambiguity is not just towards Taiwan. It affects relations, our security relations amongst all of our Asian partners and allies in a way that I think we in the United States tend to kind of forget.
So how do the rest of you, and then we'll maybe move to some questions, look at this question of strategic ambiguity, deterrence, as what should the posture of the outside world be towards this dilemma?
Yeah, I guess I'll argue the opposite, and we can have some sparks fly up here. Yes, right. So the first point is that there's no U.S. policy document that uses the language strategic ambiguity. We have a policy of strategic ambiguity. Right. Our policy is based on the 3 joint communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, and the 6 assurances, and those collectively specify a set of options that the commander-in-chief has, a set of obligations that Congress has, but none of them require the U.S. to come to Taiwan's aid in specific situations. And so I'm not actually clear on what moving to strategic clarity would involve that is different from what we have today. Tell me which policy documents we need to change and how we would change them to get to clarity. So that's the first point. The second is, why declare it? Why make an open statement in a way that is particularly provocative to Beijing when we're already doing much of what you say quietly without making that statement? And so developing operational plans with partners and allies is, I assume, well underway. Our cooperation with Taiwan has quietly, grown immensely over the last decade, certainly. And so, and the last objection I have to strategic clarity is if we say specifically in this set of situations we will intervene in this way, we are effectively drawing a line around which outside that line China can do whatever they want, and we will not necessarily intervene. And so we're saying the line is here and you can come right up to it. And we know from Chinese behavior in many other relationships that they're very good about kind of tweaking things around the edges in a way that doesn't rise up to that threshold where we would actually intervene.
Yeah, you can't get the gray zone stuff within the notion of unstrategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
But they're doing it already anyway.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what's the difference?
Well, I think we could push back more against what China is doing in certain, and we are actually. I mean, during the Trump administration, they sent a DASD to Taiwan that was the highest level Defense Department official we've sent since 1979. We can continue to do that stuff within the parameters of our one China policy.
So just one thing I noticed between 2020 and 2024 was even more conversations about Taiwan becoming, I guess, the best damn porcupine it can be, however you want to define asymmetric defense. And part of this was maybe a little Ukraine vibe and others, but this idea of more whole of society resilience, and President Tsai had really pushed that. Conscription has increased to a year from 4 months for men. There's no national service obligation for women. Some something I keep kind of pushing on and not getting a lot of traction. But two, these ideas of civil society, whether it be Forward Alliance or Kuma Academy, and thinking about, how do we get people, A, to have skills, what that could be used also if there's an earthquake, disaster preparedness, but changing the mindset and the psychology of vulnerability, and without always having people be like freaked out the sky might fall tomorrow, but being more aware of the possibility for the threat, and a sense of self-reliance. So it isn't just looking at the U.S., we want a statement of strategic clarity, but what are we going to do for ourselves, both because it's important to help ourselves and because the outside world is more likely to help us if we are showing that we are also really putting ourselves out there to be doing our own defense first and foremost.
I didn't mention that Li Chenjian is a professor and a former vice provost at Peking University, and I'm wondering and you've been there recently, how do you think China will respond to various American provocations? I mean, whatever they may be. Do you think that's an extremely sensitive climate there, or do you think the Americans can get away with some of the things that, pushing back more? And how do you read that dynamic?
It's a great question to which I don't have any answer. And it's way above my expertise, but I can say a few things. One is I think it is very sensitive. They have made it many, many times clear, this is the red line, so on and so forth. I think Kharis is correct. The U.S. side has been doing slicing the salami, kind of like Nancy Pelosi did visit Taiwan, which made the other side furious, right? These things. But the strategic clarity, I don't know how they will perceive that, but I assume it will be a pretty strong response. I think. It's a guess. But I can say one thing in this discussion. When we think about Taiwan as a geopolitical important spot in the game of great power competition, but many times we forgot to respect and think about Taiwanese, their benefit, their lives. I want to advocate that because in Taiwan, this is also a concern. And I've done my own CJ's poll by asking around. It's by no means comparable to Pew and all that. But this is a pretty strong feedback to me. And a not small percentage of people are afraid of being the victim of two great power struggle.
Like Singapore, we just heard in Indonesia.
They said, look, I mean, what about us? We are the one who will suffer the economic consequences or even military. So I think this is one thing we need to truly contemplate because it boils down to the fact that is Taiwan ready to defend itself? It's as serious as that. Will it fight like Zelensky or the other way? At least the ones I got from talking to people, I'm not clear yet. And I'll give you an example. When I ask people 3 questions in a row, I ask the first question, do you fear, or do you think in the next 10 years, China will either put it on the table, the reunification, either by peaceful means or by force in the 10 years? Most of the people said, yeah, they expect that. Then I said, whoa, if they have the, not the peaceful means, what are you guys going to do? And here is the proposal to expand the military service from 4 months to a year, not much. Are you in favor of that? Most people say, no.
It's actually a little bit, I can understand that, but
then the third question, let me finish first, third question. Then I said, wait a minute, don't you see a conflict between your first question answer and second question answer? And the third answer is really interesting. A pretty big percentage of people respond to me and say, you know what, if there is a war like that, and if the United States doesn't come to really fight for us, we're doomed anyway. If the US does come and fight for us, we are such a small military force, it doesn't matter anymore. So either way, it's not up to us. So that's the third question I asked, but how to interpret that, I will leave it to the audience.
It's Chinese fatalism.
I mean, so Austin Wong, I believe, has done analysis of this. He did a survey experiment that found that if you say that the US is coming to help support Taiwan, is coming to fight, then Taiwanese will to fight goes up by a significant percentage. So there is a positive feedback loop there. Secondly, in terms of conscription, obviously you extend conscription, especially the young men are not going to be happy about it. But what's really interesting to me is that the support for conscription, even amongst that group of people, is actually higher in Taiwan than it is in South Korea, which is generally seen as having a fairly successful conscription model. And so, there's a stronger social foundation for that sort of policy in Taiwan as opposed to than I think we often think about. Should I respond to Kharis, or should we?
Unless you have a burning few bon mots.
We'll argue offline.
Okay, I see one question here and then one over there. Let's have a mic.
Was it this one?
Quickly introduce yourself and let's be haiku-like in our brevity.
Okay, my name is Magdalene Yam, and I am a director of the Asia Society, and I'm from Hong Kong. Now, with all this discussion, I don't think none of you up there were from Hong Kong, born in Hong Kong, experienced what Hong Kong has experienced in the past maybe 5 years. Okay, well, Taiwanese, I go to Taiwan also often, and I talk to Taiwanese about their election, their view about China. I said, what is most important to you? And they said, well, freedom of speech. They can, Taiwanese can speak freely. I said, well, Hong Kong people now, they lost that, okay? And at the same time, because of we have 50 years, they're not going to change, supposedly, about the basic law. However, it was changed because of the riots in Hong Kong. The national security law of China has been applied to Hong Kong. And they make a big, big difference in Hong Kong. So now, of course, all those that it was deemed to be, promoting the independence of Hong Kong are all in the prison in Hong Kong. And one of the most, I think the famous one is Jimmy Lai right now. He's being tried using the national security law. Okay, however, and also at the same time, the word independence, so people are scared in Hong Kong across industries. So whatever they do, they worry about whatever I'm doing am I violating the national security law, in the context at least. And the one really ridiculous thing that I heard, that even Miss Hong Kong pageant is worried because they said they have a Miss China pageant. What am I going to do? Miss Hong Kong China pageant? Or should they just scrap it once and for all?
Okay, let me ask our panelists to respond to how they think the Hong Kong example reverberates in the election, in the political discourse of them. Who wants to take that up?
I can say, as I said, that in 2020, it was so much part of not just, being in the atmosphere, but the Tsai campaign. Because in the 2018 local elections, the DPP did terribly. And one thing that really did help Tsai, because it's only really 13 months between the local and then the presidential elections, but one thing that did help the DPP was saying, you don't want to end up like Hong Kong. I'll say today, this is really complicated because the the level of support for Hong Kongers in Taiwan, there's a group that is very much involved in civil society, human rights. They are working to really help the people who cannot ever probably go back, at least unless the political system changes. But overall in Taiwan, there's a lot of hesitation to immigration, sometimes more broadly, as well as particularly from Hong Kong. So it's not, it depends who you're speaking with, I find, in Taiwan and how that affects them. But I don't know if.
No, I agree.
Let's take another question.
Would they be afraid of Article 23?
I think we'll take another question because we're just out of time. So there was somebody over here, I believe.
Hello, my name is Daniel Rechtschaffen. I'm an analyst with Control Risks and formerly with the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. So I just wanted to ask, in the West and in China as well, this election is really framed as pro-independence, Lai Ching-te versus pro-unification, Hou You-yi. But you were all just in Taiwan. So how much were these heavy geopolitical issues weighing on the voters that you spoke with? Was it a geopolitical election? Was it just about domestic issues? Any light you could shed on that?
Yeah, I'll put it another way. How much did China weigh on the election?
Less than it usually does. I think these national level elections tend to be referenda to some extent on cross-strait relations. But this time, I think, Kharis, did you say it earlier that all three parties are kind of fairly unified in the sense that they want to continue Taiwan's policy, and I think Cohen's said that, William Lai obviously said that, and Hou You-yi with his 3Ds article in Foreign Affairs, it's essentially Taiwan's policy, right? I mean, and so there's a bit less distinction there in terms of the foreign policy side, but and so that allows for domestic issues to come up. That said, I was actually kind of surprised. I thought that at the very end of the campaign, those sort of cross-strait questions kind of came back in a little bit, especially with Ma Ying-jeou's flub in the German newspaper.
I think what's striking about the election is that all three parties that ran, the difference between them is not that great. No. Some say they'd like to talk, good. Let's find a way to talk. But it's not as if it seems to me that there's a giant divide that separates them. Now, we got to wrap it up.
Can I just add to that quickly? That I think, too, a lot of Taiwan's problems are really just tough problems to solve. Lowest birth rate in the world. And one thing we heard is pregnant women were getting free public transportation and maybe some Ubers. I'm like, I've had a couple kids. That wouldn't have driven me to have a third, right? Energy issues, right? You can only do so much with wind and solar. And so there's a lot of tough problems. And Richard Bush's great book, Difficult Choices, goes into this, that it makes it hard to campaign on because you can't really say, I'm going to fix this easily. And that was tough, especially for the DPP.
Well, a little bit like the world. There's not an awful lot we can fix, but we soldier on. All right, thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you.
Thank you.